Sorry, there we go. Okay, so why don't I begin by just with a quick land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Toronto, which is Treaty 13 territory. It is the home of many nations, including the Mississauga, the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Toronto today is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I know everyone is joining from other lands themselves, but so I want to also acknowledge all of the places that you're joining from. So we can jump into our topic now. We're thrilled to welcome you to this webinar on children's mental health. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated mental health concerns for children and families who are already at risk. Early data from the pandemic shows that with reduced services and disrupted access to education, healthcare, and peer networks, children do not have the ability to fully realize their rights. Today, we're going to hear from experts in their fields about the various challenges related to mental health faced by children post-pandemic, including families harmed by substance use stigma and immigrant, refugee, and structurally vulnerable children who face many challenges. On that note, I'm thrilled to introduce our three panelists today. We have Christine Gervais, Agnes Chan, and Prudence Calderu Bessette. Apologies for that. I'll begin with Christine. Christine is a professor in the nursing department at St. Jerome campus of UQO. She is a nurse and she holds a doctorate in psychology. She is also a researcher at the Sherpa University Institute focused on immigration, diversity, and health. She's particularly interested in family relationships, child welfare, and migration transition. On that note, I will turn it over to Christine to be the host, and so she can share her screen. Sorry, where did you go, Christine? There you are.
Is it good? Do you see it?
Yes, we can. It looks great.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Kate. I'm happy to be here today to share with you some reflection about the reaction study that was conducted during the first year of the pandemic and aims to describe the children and adolescent experience of the pandemic and also its effect on them and their parents. So briefly, this longitudinal study includes 4 measurement times. For each measurement period, children and adolescents were met virtually for an interview and also fill a short questionnaire. Their parents also complete a questionnaire. 150 children took part in the 4 measurement point. They are aged between 7 and 17 years old with a mean age of 11 years old. But today I will focus on the participant of the 4th measurement time. So they were first met during the first lockdown in May 20, secondly, during the progressive reopening in July 20, thirdly, in November 20, when it was in Quebec, it was the beginning of the second wave of the pandemic. And last time was in May 21, so last year, here it was the 3rd wave of the pandemic. It's importantly to say that the sample of children and adolescents we met lived in favorable socioeconomic conditions. So the experience they share may not represent experience of other children, but it's still interesting. So 82% had a parent who had complete university and 62% of them benefit from a family income above $100,000 per year. So firstly, we did the linear regression analysis to identify factors that contribute to depressive symptoms after 1 year of the pandemic, so last year in May. As you can see, altogether, the significant factor explains 55% of the variance in children and adolescent depressive symptoms. So first we have the fear of COVID that explains 6%, near 6%. We have the manageability dimension of the sense of coherence, which is defined as the feeling of control of the situation and confidence that when help will be needed, it will be available, which explains a big part of the variation, 21%. And next is the collective hope regarding the end of the pandemic, which is defined as the perception that we have the collective will and way to get out of the pandemic, which explain also 20%. Positive school experience also contribute for among 6%, and loneliness of their parents contribute for 3%. If we look at the non-significance factor, we can see that socioeconomic dimensions like child age, gender, family income, parent education, loss of income due to the pandemic did not have any impact at this moment of the pandemic for these children. In a similar way, the family condition in which the youth live, like the parents' mental health, family functioning, have also little impact of the children and adolescents' mental health. When analyzing children and adolescent discourse, 3 categories of impacts of the pandemics could be identified from their own perspective. So as we have little time, I will explain the impact, but let you read the quote from the participant. So first impact that they mention is the lack of social interaction. For many of them, the lack of proximity to their loved one is identified as the main difficulty experienced during the different wave of the pandemic. Restriction of contact with extended family members are most often reported as causing sadness, disappointment, and boredom, especially for children and preteens. Some youth were unable to maintain their ties and were really alone and isolated at the measurement time. The social breakdown seemed to have transformed their relationship. And for some young people, especially adolescents, rather than complaining about their lack of social contact, they said that they lost the habit of interacting with others, that they no longer knew how to do it, and some no longer wanted to. Fatigue in relation to health measure is also mentioned by youth as an important effect of the pandemic. Although they understand the reason for these measures, as well as their importance, it is not that these measures are becoming more and more difficult to comply with and are waiting on them more and more. They report being fed up, exasperated, and discouraged by it. And finally, the lack of intimate contact combined with the fatigue of the health measure generate negative emotions that have taken up more and more space in the youth discourse over time. Indeed, it is much more difficult for participants to identify positive impact of the pandemic or learning from it. Do you still see the presentation? No, huh? I think, Kate, you, okay.
Oh, sorry, it should be back. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Okay. So yeah, so it's harder for them to see positive impact of the pandemic during the third wave than what they were doing during the first lockdown. Conversely, stress, discouragement, and anxiety are increasing in their experience, are increasingly present, in their experience of the pandemic. Secondly, they also talk about many collective impact of the pandemic. So many believe that the pandemic has allowed for a generalized slowdown, that has led to some awareness and questioning, particularly in relation to our lifestyle and our impact on the environment. The adolescents observed that certain social issues have been more discussed in the public space during the pandemic. They appreciate being more aware of racism, climate crisis, violence against women, and gender inequalities. They also spoke about an increasing of the self-awareness. So they mentioned that the decrease of social interaction imposed with sanitary restriction allowed them to develop a better knowledge of themselves. They observed a breakdown in peer influence, which was beneficial for some who were able to enjoy greater freedom in their way of being and in their relationship with others. And finally, the young people also deplored the negative collective effect of the pandemic, which are experienced harshly by many. They explain that the fear of the virus and the fact of living with strict sanitary measures for an extended period of time distance people from each other and generate an ambient stress with which it is sometimes difficult to cope. They are quite divided on the long-term impact of the pandemic. When asked about their vision of the future following the pandemic, some believe that this period will end soon and the world will return to the way it was before the pandemic. Others believe that the pandemic will continue for several years and that they will grow up with health measures that will vary in intensity but will still remain present. On the other hand, some people see themselves in an improved world where the learning about the pandemic will be invested in creating a more stable and healthy world, while others see themselves in an increasingly unstable world with even more complex problems. For the youth that have a mostly negative vision of the future, pandemics seem to have caused an awareness about the instability of the world and the uncertainty of their future. While this uncertainty mentioned by many is mostly related to other possible pandemics, some teens also mention the challenges facing their generation. They are concerned about pollution, the climate crisis, the rising cost of living, the closing of many business and geopolitical issues that make them fear and complicated, that make them fear of complicated, unpredictable, and threatening world. So just 3 short points as a discussion. So as we see the effect of fear of COVID and the sense of manageability on youth depression symptom is really important, and highlight the importance of parents and teacher awareness about the listening, acceptance, and emotional validation that they can provide to children and adolescents, as well as about the importance of creating spaces and time for taking about COVID-19 to create nuanced meaning about the issue related to the pandemic. Professional and school staff are encouraged to broaden their definition of vulnerability in order to discern children whose well-being has been more severely compromised by the pandemic and to better support them. Beyond well-documented vulnerability factors such as poverty, housing instability, the experience young people have had during the pandemic may contribute to their vulnerability, including for children living in privileged contexts. Given the central aspect of social relation and representation of the pandemic and its effect, particular attention should be paid to children and adolescents who receive little support from their immediate family and who live with vulnerable persons. And lastly, creating more spaces and opportunity for children participation is essential. Children participation in the decision that affect them, which was already insufficient, has dropped even further in the reaction to the sanitary restriction that limit their access to the spaces and people that support their participation. Many of them experience this lack of participation as a lack of consideration and interest on the part of leaders and society toward young people who were heavily impacted by health measures, even though the virus present a very low risk to their health. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine. Really interesting. And I look forward to having a chance for us to chat about it as well. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Prudence Calderot-Bassett. She is a clinical psychologist and a postdoctoral fellow at both the Department of Integrated Studies and Education and the Department of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill University, under the supervision of Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Nadeau. She is also an adjunct professor of humanistic psychology at UQAM, and her postdoctoral research is entitled Including Children in Transcultural Mental Health Research. I will now make Prudence a host, and sorry about this, a little tricky to find you, Prudence. Where are you? Okay.
Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be here with you because I really have children's right at heart. So today my presentation is I'm gonna try to go fast. So I'm sorry if I speak sometimes fast, and English is not my first language, so sometimes I'm trying to find my words. So it's quite a challenge, but my presentation is called Arts-Based Collective Mental Health Care for Marginalized Migrant Children, Working for Children's Rights and Social Justice. And so this work was done in, I'm gonna talk about work that was done in collaboration with two colleagues, well, a lot of colleagues actually, but mainly two, Caroline Beauregard, who is a professor in art therapy at Université du Québec en Abitibi-Témiscamingue, and Claudia Mitchell, who's a professor in education at McGill University. So before I started, just in the spirit of caring for all our relationships, I wish to acknowledge that I talk today from the unceded Indigenous territory where living and non-living beings have coexisted since immemorial times. Today, the Ganyangahaga are recognized as the guardians of the lands and waters of this territory called Jojake. So just a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about mental health and care for marginalized migrant children. Then I'm going to give a few examples of collective arts-based practices and talk about some critical issues. So just framing this into children's rights, these are the rights that this work is going to be, that it touches on. So the right to well-being and health, which includes mental health, Article 3 and 24, right to play, arts, culture, language, and religion, Articles 30 and 31, the right to expression, which is formulated in Article 12, and the right for special care for refugee children, which is Article 22. So mental health and care for marginalized migrant children. Before I talk about that, I'm just going to talk a little about the general mental health of children during COVID times. It's unlike Christine's presentation, it's more around like the psychological symptoms here. So we all know that children suffered during COVID, but there is very limited research. I mean, Christine's research is one of the few researchers actually, but we have very little data on small children. And the results are sometimes contradictory. And it's some kind of balance between risk and protective factors that have an influence on how it's going to turn out. So previous difficulties can increase the risk of later difficulties, and also the risk of pandemic related difficulties and trauma. But there's also some research that show a reduction of symptoms for some children because, for example, they had more access to supportive parents, and they didn't have to deal with stresses related to school, some things like that. But so the question is, how does this, of course, as Christine said, it can be children from high income families or that can be impacted by that, but there's like overall data that I will talk about later that's more specific to marginalized children having been more impacted than other children. And we also know that screen time, unlike what we can think, can support learning and connections, and that a lack of access to technology actually widens disparities. So these are some of the risk factors that impact mental health. So separation, loss and grief, social determinants of health, social isolation, quarantine, and loneliness, special needs or disability, disrupted home and school routines, prior trauma, prior mental health disorders. So you can see that these factors can be more important for first migrant families. So during COVID, the global context is that there's a potential for social tension increase, and there's also domestic violence aggravated. So this is like a more global context, but we know from the different studies that the mental health, there was a bigger mental health impact for those who were already struggling in all different spheres of life. So the marginalized families were the most impacted. And so scholars are talking about the injustice faced by marginalized migrant children and the need to prioritize them both in intervention and research. So why do, I'm sorry, someone just got in, welcome. So why do I talk about forced migrant children and not only refugees is because not all migrant families are correspond to the UN definition of refugees, but they can still be in a difficult situation, especially asylum seekers. And so I want to have this more broader way of speaking to include different degrees of marginalization and social struggle, and not necessarily only refugees. And we know that in forced migrant children, in forced migrant families or forced migrant people around the world, there's about 40%, 42 actually, percent that are children, so it's a large proportion. So these children and families have, there's things in their context that has to be acknowledged that really impact their situation, which is they're looking for a home, of course, and so they're in different situations related to that, but some of them are going to be in shelters, or some are going to be put in detention centers. They're going to have to adapt to school, so in welcoming classes, learning a new language. And for asylum seekers or other migrants, sometimes they face rejection of their claim to status. And so this can act as some kind of repetition of trauma in the migration process, which was more intense in the COVID situation because, for example, in 2020, Canada doubled its rejection of residence application under humanitarian grounds. So this resulted in like increased fear of eviction, also in a context where travel is kind of scary with the COVID, precarity and then instability. And we can think that more families ended up being undocumented. So this impacts their situation and their mental health. Okay, so it's just here. So the work I'm going to be talking about is in Quebec. So in Quebec, there's increased tensions related to religion and language, and this impacts migrant minorities. So we have to be especially aware of that in Quebec, which is true elsewhere also. But so we know that for forced migrant children, of course, the families struggle, and they have been facing a lot of relational losses in their paths. Children, first migrant children, are more at risk of developing mental health problems like anxiety, depression, and they also have often trauma experiences, and so are at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. But we also have to acknowledge that there is an important potential for resilience in migrant families, which has been called the healthy immigrant effect. But this is not to say that they should be resilient. This resilience can be supported and should be. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about. Here you just see a little figure from a study from SPAS, like a recent study. And I just want to bring your attention to the fact that the factor here, perceived discrimination, has the most impact on every, different aspects of mental health symptoms. And so this is really to bring your attention to the fact that there's an importance of the relationship with the social environment. So what can we do to support this resilience? There is something that's called psychological first aid that is based on 5 principles, and that is an approach that was developed not for mental health practitioners, but for any worker that works with migrant children, marginalized migrant children or families. So the 5 principles are to foster a sense of safety, to allow for hope to exist, to have experiences of self-efficacy, to support communication, which is sometimes difficult with the language learning, and also to support connectedness. So connectedness is the feeling of being connected to the environment, the people, the place where we live. So I'm sorry. Okay. So this is an overall approach, but when we talk about specifically PTSD, there are researchers like Rousseau and al. that talk about the pertinence of having a progressive approach. So an approach that is not necessarily focused on trauma, but it's going to be more general, and a more specifically focused on symptoms approach can be used after, but to focus more on emotional security and social well-being in a first step. So this is kind of the idea as we had in mind. And so I was talking before about the injustice that the marginalized migrant children are facing. So these psychological first aid practices can act as a kind of social justice response when we prioritize marginalized children. And we can do that through arts-based collective care, as I will talk about a little bit more. So I'm going to give very, very quickly some examples. If you have questions or are more interested, you can also always contact me. So this is a program that is school-based that was developed by Sherpa, the Sherpa team, and that is directed by Caroline Beauregard. So it's a program that is in welcoming classes and that is age appropriate, using sound play for small ones, arts and storytelling, and plurality drama, so theatrical expression in schools. And so here you have the link to the program, and you have some images of the children in workshops. So the guiding principles in those workshops were to work with the teacher, and also to have fun, be non-judgmental, be non-performance focused. So to really focus on the process and not the result, and work with the group and be non-stigmatizing. It also works with an opening and closing rituals, which fosters security. And there's the idea of including all languages, cultures, and religion in the workshops, the intervention. And so these workshops have been, there's many researchers that have argued for the positive effects of this program. So about emotional awareness and safety, hope, connectedness, and solidarity. So you can check out the references if ever you're interested. And it was also adapted to temporary shelters for asylum seekers, so for the short term. So here you have a little quote from a participant who said, "I feel the realm of joy, I feel the realm of heart in me," which speaks about how it made feel the children. So I'm going to be talking about a second example, which is based on participatory arts workshop organized by the Participatory Cultures Lab of McGill with Claudia Mitchell, who's the director of the lab. So these arts workshops were organized for children from governmental temporary shelters and bringing them at McGill, also with two different, with a community center and another shelter in Montreal. So it was before and during COVID. So the PCL activities, so the participatory activities that happened were for multiple, as you can see. So we did body mapping, 3D modeling, bee boxes, chalk art. We did also a book launch with all the images of the art of the children, which many people participated in that. Postcards, Henny designs, photo, voice, and cell films, which are participatory methods based on photos and videos. And we also did activities which was like an extension more to get familiar with the environment of the winter and the weather here, and also like getting more familiar with the close environment, like the park that was next to this is work that was done with Foyer du Monde. That's a shelter in Montreal. So going to the park, writing their names in the park on the ground with chalk, allowing themselves to go play in the park, even if it's winter, going apple picking. And so getting a little bit familiar with the environment. So underlying ideas of this work were that in the genres of art making that or activities that we're choosing, there is kind of the medium is the message spirit to it. So it's like creating ownership in a time of instability and temporary living spaces. And so we also wanted to create this kind of connection with the environment and social context. So we asked with activities, how the children were feeling, their connection to nature, and also postcards to essential workers. And the workshops were also facilitated by people from the community, from various backgrounds like education, psychology, arts, and also from various languages. So giving this impression that the people here are have at heart to welcome the children. And we also have had this approach to amplify the voices of the children through an access to new technology. So we brought iPads so that to give the children a chance to participate in this new digital world. And of course, having fun was very important. So critical issues about this work is that we think that it can foster emotional and social well-being, and studied that too, through principles of psychological first aid, security, hope, effectiveness, communication, and connectedness, especially through allowing expression beyond language through the arts, and also allowing connectedness and a sense of belonging. So feeling welcome, feeling included in this environment where they are living right now. Also fostering cultural exchanges. So like the Henny design activity was provided by a former participant. And so this kind of exchange is allowing for identity to exist, cultural identity, and also gives hope for the future. And many of the activities were also thought to allow for the children to feel that they have the right to exist, and they have the right to have their cultural identity, and also to give them the feeling that they can do things. So they can do arts, they can do modeling, they can do, so that this self-efficacy experience. So if we go back to end my presentation, going back to the children's rights, you can see and feel, I hope, how this tackles onto all the different rights that I mentioned before, and also can link to the right to, can support the right to education, because we know that when children are struggling and their mental health is not so good, there are not available for education. So fostering this resilience and overall well-being can also support the right to education. Okay, I don't have the, I was just gonna put my email address, but it's okay. The last slide.
Sorry about that, Prudence. Maybe you can
No
just
problem.
put it in the chat and we can, people can contact you there.
No problem.
So thank you very much. It's very interesting. And I liked how you tied it back to children's rights there at the end. I am going to make Agnes our final host. Let me just find you, Agnes. There you are. And as you get set up, I will give a little introduction to Agnes, who I'm so thrilled we have connected with at CCRC. She is a registered nurse, a social justice advocate, and the founder of Starlings Community, which is a not-for-profit whose mission is to protect the health and promote the healing of youth exposed to parental substance abuse. So over to you, Agnes.
Thank you very much, Kate, and everyone for being here. So I'll give a brief overview of Starlings and really just the issue, as I know this is an issue that is not often talked about. And so I really want to make sure that we kind of understand, why is this important? Why do we exist? So Starlings Community, our mission is to protect the health and promote the healing of youth exposed to stress and stigma of apparent substance use. And we really focus on that stigma aspect, which often removes support from parents who have a substance use disorder and often doesn't acknowledge or have any supports for children within that home, as we will talk about. And I just quickly, I am here in Mohkinstsis, Calgary on Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley nations, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta on Region 3. And this is our beautiful fall and spring skies that we're fortunate to receive. So Starlings Community, as I mentioned, our mission is to protect the health and promote the healing, recognizing that resilience happens in the context of adversity, and often children growing up in a home with a parent who has unaddressed trauma and a substance use disorder, they have overcome adversity to exist where they are today. And so we do that through resource and program development, a lot of advocacy work, and then knowledge mobilization, which is what I'm going to be presenting today. This presentation is off of our report, which I did put in the chat for everyone to see, that we created in this past year. And so a lot of this will reflect that report, as well as a questionnaire we put out, a general questionnaire we put out to Canadians in the fall of 2021 regarding how has the stress and stigma of apparent substance use impacted your mental health and well-being, both as a youth, if you are a youth today, or as an adult who grew up as a youth within that home. And so there is a 3-minute video I will share that summarizes those results. And so how prevalent is this? Why do we exist? And why do we have to have a group that specifically focuses on this population? In Canada, it's about 18 to 20% of youth who are exposed to apparent substance use disorder. We know this can be higher in communities and family members who are exposed to adverse circumstances such as chronic poverty, racism, etc., similar to the other experiences that we heard of today. The literature tells us that these youth are at double to triple the risk for suicide, mental illness, and a substance use disorder. So 3 issues that we all, I'm sure here in some capacity, are trying to decrease or advocate for a reduction in. And so this slide I always look at and say, you know, we know it's a large portion of our youth who are experiencing this. We know there is, you know, huge risk to their mental health. And just as a reflection piece, if you can consider and think about what supports do you know are available today for youth who are growing up in these environments. And our goal when we talk about stigma reduction, because from coast to coast, when we reach out and we talk about substance use prevention, etc., it actually often means treatment for a person who has a substance use disorder. And when we're talking about preventing substance use disorder within youth and stopping that intergenerational cycle of trauma and substance use disorder, we have to look at youth who are some of the highest at risk. And there are no targeted supports that meet youth where they're at. And so when we look at that risk, a lot of the literature highlights what does that home environment look like? What are the behaviors and emotions of parents? But to really understand that risk, we have to look at both the home and community environment. We know the community plays an important role within the protective factors that families are offered that can mitigate this risk. And so I just want to quickly highlight both of these two environments that that child is exposed to. And so we know SUDs for substance use disorder, also known as an addiction, is rooted in the social determinants of health. So we know it's rooted in experiences primarily of unaddressed trauma, so increased stress in childhood. And this is true in the literature sort of throughout. There's literature that says up to 70% of people with a substance use disorder have experienced trauma, if not more. That up to 50% of people with a substance use disorder have CPTSD, chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But in any case, we know that it is often rooted back to experiences of trauma and stress. Related to that is youth who grow up in these homes, the evidence tells us, are at increased risk of abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, having a parent who's been incarcerated, and involvement in the child welfare system. And each of these come with their own set of stigma, but again, that contribute to that, that sense of safety and support within that home. And then lastly, we have to consider how stigma impacts parents. The literature again reminds us stigma increases the risk of reoccurrence in parents who have abstained from alcohol, so have maybe gone to treatment and have taken an abstinence route for recovery. We know that stigma contributes to the availability of supports. And so predominantly we have Western-based treatment options for individuals. And so if a parent doesn't have the capacity in that moment to choose treatment or recovery or abstinence-based supports, we know that that stigma can be increased. And overall, we know, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction has done surveys, and it shows that about 80% of people with a substance use disorder meet barriers to recovery. And then we have to reflect on, well, how does this stigma, we know that stigma increases stress in parents in individuals who have a substance use disorder. So we have to consider if substance use disorder is rooted in the social determinants of health, in these experiences of stress. We know that stigma increases stress in parents. How does that stress impact a parent's capacity for nurturing parenting practices? How does it increase their capacity, or how does it impact their capacity for healthier substance use? And so all of these things play into what that home environment looks like. When we talk about COVID-19 and what that might mean for that home environment and that parent, literature from, again, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction in 2021 showed that 18% of females and 28% of males with children younger than 13 years of age indicated problematic or risky alcohol use during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is from the Government of Canada, March of this year. During the first year of the pandemic, there was a 95% increase in apparent opioid toxicity deaths compared to the year prior. For males and females, the majority of these accidental toxicity deaths were between the age of 20 to 59. And when you narrow it down even further, it's 30 to 49 was that age. When we look at the average age of a first-time parent in Canada, it's 31. We don't have any indicators of how many children are being bereaved from this crisis, but numbers of deaths are similar to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have heard about, children bereaved to the COVID-19 pandemic. We haven't had any acknowledgement or discussion around what happens to children who are bereaved from a parent who has died from a toxic death, whether they have a substance use disorder or not. How does this tragedy impact their mental health and well-being on its own, but how does that stigma and the negative discourse regarding this toxic drug supply impact their mental health and well-being, which literature again shows that discourse impacts the way a child can grieve, impacts the supports they are offered, and impacts their ability to seek out supports. Again, this is from CCRC. About 1 in 3 people with a history of substance use disorders reported suicidal ideation during the pandemic. 30% of women and 36% of men. Again, just highlighting what is that emotional home environment that child might be living in, and the supports or lack of supports that their family has access to. And then again from CCSA, people with past and current substance use concerns showed signs of worsening mental health during the pandemic, and increased in contemplation of suicide, which is consistent with what everyone else has said today about, we know that individuals who are in adverse circumstances, who are already marginalized, their mental health, it showed that they had a worse time coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then so that's that side of, what is that home environment? What does that mean in terms of supports for parents and whole families when we look at those experiences of youth? And then we have to look at, again, that community environment that directly impacts a child. And in the beginning of when I chatted and I asked everybody to reflect on, what supports do you know of that exist? Knowing that stigma is a barrier for youth to reach out for support. We know that stigma, there's an overrepresentation of children whose parents have a substance use disorder within the child welfare system. We know there's overrepresentation of parents within the criminal justice system related to their substance use. What supports are proactively available that meet children where they're at? And for us, our main goal is how are we decreasing that internalized shame that they may carry and increase their hope? Because we know decreased hope leads to adverse health outcomes such as suicide, anxiety, depression. And so we have to consider all these different ways. And so instead of talking about it, because there's lots I can highlight within this short time, I just want to share, again, that 3-minute video that we created to show the results of what youth told us related to how stigma has impacted them. And just quickly, these are just some of the blurbs. You can see here the oldest ages from 24 to 35, but some of these are 14 to 18-year-olds who respond, how has stigma impacted your ability to seek out supports? Trauma doesn't always look like trauma. Sometimes it looks like internalized shame and embarrassment and guilt. I never reached out for help because it's not always safe to tell someone, especially when the system can't always guarantee your safety. The level of shame the entire family feels, that one's gonna actually be in the video. I didn't want my siblings and I to end up in foster care. I was too scared to be taken away. There was no help. Every time we reached out, we were treated badly. Alternatives to living with my parents were much worse. So we have to consider what is the role of stigma within the intergenerational cycles of stress and trauma and substance use disorder within families who are coping with unaddressed trauma and stigma within the community. And so here is the video.
I wish people would listen to the entire story and be more understanding and accepting, because people in these situations need people that care, not people that judge.
Stigma, amplifying the voices of children impacted by the stigma of a parent's addiction. Starling's community is ensuring youth impacted by the stress and stigma of a parent's addiction are offered hope and empowered to heal. As part of this effort, we conducted a survey to gain insight into the experiences of impacted youth and adults. We asked individuals how stressful they felt their childhood was because of a parent's substance use. 44.2% said extremely stressful, and 35.4% said stressful. They told us that as a youth, the experiences with a parent's addiction impacted their mental health, 96%, stress level, 95%, social life, 83%, and schoolwork, 67%.
The anger I had as a child wasn't my fault. I had no idea how to cope with it, why I felt this way, or why it was happening to me. I carried that anger with me for a long time.
As an adult, the experiences with a parent's addiction impacted their mental health, 89%, stress level, 75%, social life, 53%, and parenting, 25%. Individuals who did not reach out for mental health support as a youth explained why. 36% said shame, and 34% said stigma. Individuals who did not reach out for mental health support as an adult explained why. 28% said shame, and 22% said stigma.
It's hard to heal from something with so much shame around it. You feel as though you can't reach out and that nobody's there to help or care.
38% of youth disagree or strongly disagree that their parents were treated with dignity and respect by the healthcare and justice system.
I want society to understand the level of shame the entire family feels, the struggle of loving someone who hurts you but doesn't want to, how much criminalization hurts.
In Canada, approximately 1/6 of youth are impacted by the stress and stigma of a parent's addiction. This places youth at a substantially increased risk for suicide, mental illness, and addiction itself. We are on a mission to change that. Impacted youth told us what helped.
I don't want to be understood. I just want kids to know that they aren't alone.
Seeking help from a therapist or counselor.
Getting in touch with my Indigenous roots. Being more connected with family.
Become an ally today, committed to ending the stigma of addictions so that youth can move forward with hope.
And so that is the video and what we came to. And I just in closing, I just as a reflective piece again, oftentimes in conversations coast to coast, people will say to us, how come no youth has brought this forward in roundtable discussions? And the reality is, knowing the impact and prevalence, when we look at 20% of youth and the adverse health outcomes that they are at risk for, and how stigma impacts them, we have to be asking ourselves, why can't youth bring this up at youth roundtables? And why are we expecting youth to share these stories in order to ensure that supports are available? We know that increasing the protection offered to families within the community is one of the most important pieces we can, that protection offered through cultural connectedness, community supports, adult champions in that youth's life. But we really have to consider, how is stigma impacting that protection offered from the community, whether it's policymakers, community supports, schools, or advocates, people, in this group. How are we ensuring that there is more supports, that we're validating these experiences, and that supports are actually in place so that children have hope that their outcomes can change. In any case, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Agnes, and thank you, everyone. That was really interesting, and I think you all brought up a lot of important issues related to mental health in children. Before I go on, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask for questions from the audience. I know there's already been a few comments, but maybe just in case anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question. Or you're welcome to type it in the box too, if you'd prefer. Well, I can ask the first question if people don't have any. So I guess my question kind of goes to what all of you are saying, and you've all touched on rights a little bit. I mean, I think Prudence, you explicitly talked a little bit about certain rights that came out, and again, Agnes and Christine as well. So and one of the things that I noticed was that you're talking about the role of communities, as well as the role of parents, as well as the role of government. So when you talk to young people about what they need to realize their rights to good mental health, what do you want to see governments do? I know that's a broad question, but maybe I'll ask you, what is one thing you'd like to see governments commit to? I'll start with you, Agnes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. For me, it's certainly, we need that acknowledgement. I mean, and that is challenging because the way that we advocate is really, we want to get community support, because we know we vote in our politicians, we say what matters. However, knowing the stigma and the negative discourse that exists, and knowing that youth aren't going to come together and out loud, and I mean, we do have youth volunteers, but it's not going to be in droves like we see when we're advocating for mental health supports. We need our government to take that literature that says, yes, this exists, this is real, including every single organization that says, actually, yes, this is a gap in our organization as well. And so what we want to see is our leadership say, hey, this is an issue, stigma is impacting these youth. Because a lot of what we're hearing in the discourse around parental substance use disorder is parents are bad, right? The behaviors, emotions are bad. And so we criminalize or penalize parents. We need to increase the supports, and we can start that by our government acknowledging it, increasing funding specific for this population, and ensuring that those supports are therefore proactively available within current systems, knowing that stigma is too big of a risk and too big of a barrier for children who are reaching out.
Thanks, Agnes. Christine?
In my way, I think the most important will be to develop more spaces for sharing and discussing with young people. They're rarely consulting about what they really need, which contribute, I think, to the fact that it's limit their confidence and their ability to for asking, but also to understanding their needs. So I think more space of participation will be the first step for best services for their mental health.
I think it's a really good point, and it speaks to the importance of talking to rights holders themselves about what they need. Prudence, anything to add?
Well, for me, I'm sorry about the noise. I guess that supporting programs like that make available group activities for children together, because someone in the chat was pointing out how the mental health of parents impact children, which is true. But for marginalized migrant children, often it's important to have a space away from this struggling situation their parents are in, and to have this just genuine experience of being children together, having fun, and being allowed to be themselves. And they are most of the time in the school system, which is pretty restrictive, but it's important to also have these spaces that are more free of this more, I don't know, like this more specific education, I think. And to put the children's rights on top of the list while supporting this kind of activities.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that makes a big difference. And putting it at the top of the list, as you say, is really important. As some of you know, Canada was just reviewed by the UN, and children's rights to mental health did come up, and we're hoping to get some concluding observations that will mention mental health. And I think it's a great idea that someone wrote in the chat that we should follow up with the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Minister Carolyn Bennett. We should be following up and saying, okay, so this is what came out of the UN. Here's what came out of a webinar that the CCRC hosted. How are you going to concretely address these issues around stigma, around youth participation, around really promoting that rights-based approach? So yeah, I think that's a great idea. Anyone else have a question or a comment they want to make? I do see comments in the chat, so I'm also welcome, couldn't do those if that's helpful. It is also 12:59. So, I also appreciate that people may have to go, including our panelists. But do we have one final question from anyone? There's one about whether Starlight has a chat group for children. Agnes, I don't know if you want to take that one, or how do you engage with children, perhaps?
Absolutely. So that is certainly a challenge. So we do have a peer support group, and a lot of the peer support that we do is sort of through an empowerment model. I just put in the chat, we have a forward guide that we have programming that our peer support model is based off of. It really is just helping youth understand, how does stress impact your emotions and behaviors? How do we acknowledge and validate your experiences of grief with your parents? And then how do we actually help you and empower you to reconnect to your community, yourself, and your culture, whatever that may be across the spectrum, knowing that's different. And so I put in that forward guide, which we do have available for Canadian youth and adults, that we can send a hard copy to. I also want to touch on the conversation with Minister Bennett, which we have had, and it was brought up as, how do we bring this forward as a children's rights issue, which is really important to us. Just again, keeping in mind that often internationally, the narrative around children's rights and parental substance use, again, it comes back and actually negatively impacts that family environment because of the stigma and how we penalize and criminalize parents because of behaviors. And so if we're talking about getting to the root of these issues and mitigating that risk, we really have to look at stigma as from a human rights lens. And so I just want to throw that in, as that is certainly a conversation we are excited to have.
Thanks, Agnes. Any final questions? No? Okay, well, a big thank you to all of our presenters. I really appreciate you making the time. This was a fantastic webinar. Some of the comments in the chat, I don't know if you saw them, but they all said this was such a great webinar. So really thank you very much. I think it's been very interesting. I will connect with the presenters, and I'll try to maybe share some of the PowerPoints if that's okay. And if not, then I will share the recording. So we'll figure it out. We'll get back to you. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for attending, everyone, too. Yeah, nice comments in the chat. Thank you very much, Christine and Agnes. It was really great. And Prudence, you're still there too. Sorry, I'm sorry I was a little bit glitchy with the